into week 6 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I looked at on the waiver wire this week. The first guy is Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So I got a lot of questions about Greg Joseph during the week. And hey, he had a huge week, no doubt about it. I did have him on my sleeper video, but people were questioning why he wasn't in my top 12. And yeah, he wasn't in my top 12. It was Joseph, but he led the league in fantasy points this week with 17, hitting 27-yarder, hitting a 33-yarder, 34-yarder, a 52-yarder, and a 54-yarder to win the ball game for the Vikings here. So next week it's going to be a tougher matchup, obviously, for Greg Joseph, where he's not going to be indoors in Minnesota. He's going to be at the Carolina Panthers that give up the least amount of fantasy points to kickers. But right here, Joseph, he's probably a guy that should be rostered on all 12-team leagues now. He's available right now. Is Joseph in 85% of fantasy leagues. And so far in his rookie year, he scored double-digit fantasy points 3 out of the first 5 games this season. So this week, if you need a kicker, he's definitely a big ad. The next guy is Nick Folk of the New England Patriots. And Nick Folk had a good ball game in week 5 at Houston with 14 fantasy points, 2 52-yarders, 36-yarder, and a chip shot 22-yarder to put the game away here. And he hit an extra point, but also missed an extra point. So week 6 versus the Dallas Cowboys, they're a little vulnerable to kickers. In this ball game, obviously the Patriots are going to have to put up points if they want to keep up with Dak Prescott and that high-powered Dallas Cowboy offense. But right here, Nick Folk, he's pretty consistent and a pretty good kicker so far this season with 3 double-digit fantasy days in the first 5 weeks of the season. And he's available right now in 81% of fantasy leagues. The next kicker I looked at on the waiver wire this week is Graham Gano with the New York Giants. So Graham Gano had a good ball game in week 5 at Dallas with a 52-yarder and a 51-yarder in this one and 2 extra points. So right here, we know this Giant team's banged up with injuries. Daniel Jones, we don't know if he's going to play next week. Kenny Golladay, Slayton, and Shepard all banged up at their wide receiver position. And Saquon Barkley with the ankle. But right here, this team, there might be a lot of opportunities for Graham Gano where they're not going to punch it into the end zone with not a lot of talent on offense, especially if these guys who I mentioned are injured are going to be out a while. And in week 6, it's going to be a tough matchup for the New York Giants versus the Rams. But the Rams, they're the type of defense that bends but don't break here. And they do give up the 10th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right here, Graham Gano, I think he could have a couple opportunities in week 6. And he's been a pretty accurate kicker as well in his New York Giant career. And he's available right now in 91% of fantasy leagues. The next kicker I've looked at on the wire this week, McLaughlin of the Cleveland Browns. So I've mentioned McLaughlin as an ad over the last few weeks here, and he's been pretty solid in fantasy football. The last 3 games for him: week 3 versus Chicago, 18 fantasy points; week 4 at the Vikings, 9 fantasy points; and week 5 at the Chargers in that crazy shootout, he had 10 fantasy points, a 36 and 38-yarder with 4 extra points. But right here in week 6, you know they're going to have to try to put points on the board. Once again, he has this Cleveland Brown team versus the 5-0 Arizona Cardinals coming up in next week here. So right here, he's putting points on the board, which is good to see. And he's a pretty accurate kicker as well, is McLaughlin for this Brown team. So right here, he's available in 81% of fantasy leagues. And I would give him an ad in the 5th and final kicker. I looked at on the wire this week, Mason Crosby of the Green Bay Packers. So I know Crosby missed 3 field goals in week 5 at Cincinnati, but he had so many opportunities in that ball game here. He had 4 made and he missed 3, so 7 attempts on field goals for Crosby, and he hit an extra point and missed an extra point. So right here, he's in one of the better offenses in all of pro football with the Green Bay Packers, and they got a good matchup week 6 at the Chicago Bears, where I could see the Bears defense bend but don't break as well here in Soldier Field with this NFC North matchup between the Packers and the Chicago Bears. So right here, he's available right now in 65% of fantasy leagues. And I would give him a shot, even though he missed 3 field goals. Before that, he hit 26 in a row or something, is Crosby. So he was just a little off, but he still won the ball game on a walk-off field goal in overtime. And I think he'll bounce back next week. So that's a few kickers I looked at on the waiver wire heading into week 6 of the fantasy football season.